Recording in. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We're on September's Community of Practice COVES webinar, and we're excited to see several of your faces and really get the community going again for our first call since July. On today's session, we're going to hear from Alex at the Museum of Science and the COVES core team, where we recently did some analyses on the aggregate and institutional data over the last 2-year period. So we know things have been volatile, to say the least, and that methods have switched and staffing has changed, and we've all had museum closures. So we took this opportunity at a recent conference to try and do some pre-post comparisons from what things looked like just before museums shut down in March 2020 to what things looked like just afterwards at an institutional level for those who are participating, and at the aggregate level, so we could try and paint a picture of like what we might call a new normal, or a summary of the last 6 months of data. And we had some interesting findings. So without trying to give too much away, I'll turn it right over to Alex for screen sharing and a discussion of the analyses. Throughout this, if you have questions or comments about what Alex is sharing, please use the chat. We will come back to that afterwards and open up a conversation. Alex, over to you.
Sure. So as some of you who were at the ASTC conference last week may have briefly seen this poster. I kind of pulled some of the charts into a presentation and changed some stuff that I felt was hard to explain when I was standing at the poster, but I had some great conversations. And just a little bit of context first, as Ryan mentioned, kind of because of the nature of this like pre-post comparison, this is just science centers right now. And also an extremely variable number of science centers as people open, closed, opened again, closed again, stop collecting data, all sorts of crazy things. So I'm not dwelling on that in the analysis, really, just know that it's very complicated. And sometimes noted like how many museums were involved, but it was very fluctuating. So I'll jump into the screen share here. So the poster was called Visitor Data in the
Uh-oh.
But kind of thinking about that period of time just before March 2020 and then after up until now. So we have a lot of data involved here. So just I'll start with, and also we did like 3 different, I suppose, lenses or ways of looking at the data. And so the first one I looked at was what I was calling sort of the first reopening. So like immediately before COVID and immediately after, what crazy stuff was happening when we reopened. So this is all individual museums compared to each other. It's not, you know, aggregated together or weighted. So you'll see individual anonymized, you know, data points and lines here and there. And I was thinking about like a quarterly basis, but of course the opening and the closing did not happen, you know, cleanly on a quarter start date. So we're looking at the pre-COVID is December, January, and February 2019. And then March was too hard to kind of throw in there. And then the post dates are variable for everybody. So I looked up and confirmed like opening dates for the sites that were collecting data not long after reopening. You know, some of you reopened and then didn't collect data for several months for whatever reason or another. So that's not really included here. But so sites that opened and were able to collect data right away, those are included, or, you know, within a few weeks. But it may have been July 27, I think was the first, or, you know, August 1, like right when the COVE survey was available, or June or something, or it might have been a year later for those of you who were closed for a more extended period of time, but included all of it, you know, from pre-closing to reopening. So just know that it's all over the place. And of course, also, I know that a number of you and us had sort of, you know, variable sort of conditions for reopening, like maybe it was just your outdoor space, or maybe it was just numbers for a few months, and that's still reopening. So it's all of the, not distinguishing between like partial and full, looked for whatever date on your website that was like, the museum is open. So with that in mind, the first thing we looked at was Net Promoter Score. That's always an interesting thing to check out. So the thing that is most, I guess, noticeable here is that the range of scores widened a lot for the museums that we had this available data for. The pre sort of range was 17 points, and then it grew to over 30 points. So it like doubled from before to after. There's a lot of reasons why this could have been. You know, so sites that, oh, sorry, I forgot to add all of the little stars. I'll add that in before sending this presentation around. Little asterisk for sites that switched to email collection. So some like Gretchen's work that was presented a few weeks ago suggested that there could be demographic differences based on the email method versus the in-person data collection method, i.e. more members being represented in emails who historically have given higher net promoter scores, although not necessarily in that immediate post-COVID time. But also as something that I had, theorized way back then, and then was reading in a blog post again recently, that it's kind of awkward to recommend visiting a science center or it was probably a little bit weird to recommend that to somebody in June, July 2020. Some people felt comfortable enough to do it, some people didn't, and it just seemed like kind of a strange thing to do. So that may have certainly had an effect on especially those sites where it went down. And another thing is that the visiting experience, of course, changed a lot. Visitors had to get used to a lot of new protocols and like buying their ticket in advance online and just doing their visit much differently. So that could be good or it could be bad, and probably varied a lot with individual sites. So the next thing, and actually kind of peppered throughout here are some nice quotes that you folks provided. And so this one is actually from Caitlin Tracy Miller at Cincinnati Art Museum. Don't have to read the whole thing, but I'll sort of summarize to say that you guys saw an increase in your net promoter score, and your theory about it was that people were happy that the museum was open and was sort of a place for them to go. And I think that I would agree that that's probably a good, theory for why some people may have seen their net promoter score go up, just, grateful to be back out and doing something familiar and friendly again. This one is overwhelming, so just pause while I explain it. I was looking at the percentage of white-only visitors. So, sort of the inverse of saying like visitors of color versus white-only visitors. A lot of times we look at this sort of white-only percentage and look about how it changes or doesn't change over time. So what I noticed here when looking at each site's, percentage of white visitors is that for about 2/3 of the sites that we had the data for, that percentage went up. So there were more white visitors as a share of the total, visitor population post reopening than before. So, could be a lot of reasons for that as well that we all spoke about. And so this is something I wanted to look at, especially because June, July 2020 was in the deep midst of that big racial reckoning that happened after George Floyd was murdered. And, museums were talking about this and are still talking about it, but certainly very intensely at that time. And so the interesting thing is that some sites actually saw a decrease in their white-only visitor population. And this is one area where I think that the email method, again, as Gretchen's work sort of suggested, may be driving some of this change. All the sites that had the biggest jumps switched from in-person to email. And so that blue is on-site data collection. So if you see two blue bars next to each other, that site stayed collecting data on-site. And if you see a blue and a green, that means they switched. This site did both. That's why they have blue and green. So the email method could certainly have been driving something here. And I think there's more and more data that we've been compiling to suggest that that method introduces bias in a number of places. So let me see. I think I have another quote here. Oh yes, this is a long quote, but this is from Beth Katz at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. And Beth, I think, has talked to us on this webinar in the past about seeing some, changes in their visitor race and ethnicity breakdown. And like, actually, what I remember, Beth, you talking about is seeing that the percentage of, I think, visitors who specifically identified as Hispanic or Latinx went down. But this quote actually, Beth, seems like that percentage has sort of maybe returned back to what it was back with method shifts and full reopening. So it's just really, really good to know, and happy that for some of us, at least, maybe it was a methodological artifact of the data. So, and I really like this part of the quote where Beth says that the survey data hold us accountable to the mission of being a museum of and for Los Angeles. So lastly, bonus, this wasn't on the poster, but Ryan and I both noticed it in some separate analysis that we were doing. again, site by site, so there's like a bunch of individual graphs here, looking at the overall experience rating. So again, this was a little bit of a clearer trend than the Net Promoter Score, in that almost all of the sites that we had data for saw that top category, which was superior, and we changed it to outstanding, corresponding with the reopening. So we changed it during the period of time that we were closed. Saw that go up. So, 58 to 62, 38 to 49%, 29% to 44%. Almost everybody, it increased. So what was happening there, right? And Ryan noticed this in the aggregate sense as well. Are visitors having a more amazing experience? Like maybe it's awkward to recommend visiting a museum or science center, but you had a good experience because you didn't have to fight anybody for the exhibits for once, and you could do whatever you wanted. Maybe it was a method shift, again, something about visitor, preferences or inclinations when responding to email versus in person. Or maybe, as we didn't think would happen based on our prior research, but did that language change from superior to outstanding have an unexpected consequences? We definitely had the research to suggest it shouldn't make a difference, but that doesn't mean that it didn't. So I think we have a couple of sites that have some data that might help us look into this a little bit more. We can't really, with the way it all happened, we don't really feel like we can compare the data we have around it, but for sites that had a little bit more to compare, we're going to take a look at that, and hopefully, maybe it'll drive a change. Maybe we change to a different word, or maybe we think differently about it. If it turns out that that's skewing our data quite a bit, but we found this pretty interesting as well. So kind of a difference between NPS and OER in that particular instance. So that's the first sort of lens of the data. So this one, I wanted to look at when when anyone, first reopened until now, quarter by quarter by quarter by quarter. And so there's a variable number of sites included in each quarter. Sometimes it's like 8, sometimes it's like 23, depending on who's open and collecting data. Just looking at each quarter, and if the quarter had less than 50 surveys for each museum, it just left it out. And then for this particular analysis that I'm going to talk about, we grouped the sites by region. Roughly the AAM regions, although there were 2 sites that were kind of on their own in a region that happened to also technically be on the East Coast. So I just put them in with the East Coasters, Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. But they're included in the East Coast here, is New York and Florida. Okay, so this was a analysis that we've been wanting to do for a long time, which was looking at potential regional differences in the way visitors were perceiving COVID risk and having COVID concern. So this theoretically, we could have included art museums in this, but most art museums didn't ask the COVID questions in this way that the science centers chose to at the beginning, and especially over this time period. So what I've graphed here is actually kind of the inverse. So this is people who are not at all concerned about COVID. So as this number goes up, or as this line goes up rather, COVID concern goes down across the board. So when we started out, anywhere between 21% and 37% of visitors said they were just not at all concerned about it. As opposed to, now between 49 and 50% of visitors are saying they really are not concerned. But what's interesting about it is that you can see at the beginning, now, and sort of persisting throughout, there is a regional difference. This is sort of averaged across all the museums that are included in this region. There does appear to be some kind of a difference. We all were seeing it and perceiving it and watching the news and everything and thinking like, wow, I think this part of the country or this state or city is experiencing this very differently than I am in my state or region or city. And, it's always interesting to see that kind of bear out in the data. So even, in July 2020, 37% of the visitors at the Midwestern museums were just, not at all concerned already. That was pretty early, and there was just low concern. Of course, it fluctuates all over the place. Like you can see in July, September 2020 quarter here, you see this dip probably when the Delta variant was coming in onto the scene and everybody was talking about it, and then kind of going back up again. Interestingly, the same thing did not happen for Omicron, even though it was much more contagious. And again, a little bit of a recent dip, which may just be because we didn't have a full quarter of data yet, but also maybe people are feeling more concerned again, as restrictions go away and people just sort of forget about it on the whole. But if you haven't forgot about it, you may be still concerned. So it was interesting to kind of see that play out. We've been talking about actually looking at these numbers for quite a while. So that's the only thing in there. But then Elisa actually is the one who had been asking about this for quite a while and was just quoted just sort of saying like that question, those data were useful to sort of track how visitors were responding as local regulations, and therefore, the Science Center's policies and regulations changed or didn't change over time. And so lastly, Ryan had more of a hand in this one, so correct me if I get anything wrong here, Ryan, but we wanted to do our old, what we used to do in the aggregate reports of pushing everybody together and weighting all the data so that any one museum or really any one museum is not sort of dominating the data set. So small museums and larger museums, or those who joined earlier or later, are contributing more equally to the full set of data. So this is aggregate with some criteria for inclusion, is that to sort of get more numbers in there, we did 6 months pre-COVID versus, it was a full month. So we did July of 2022 and back. So 6 months up until basically now. So there's only, and it's staff data collection only. So no more method weirdness. This is just same old classic COVES. But only 8 science centers kind of fit all those criteria. So this is fewer museums right now, but keeping that in mind, going back to the sort of cleaner method of comparison that we used to be able to do. So what we see there, this is, I think I've talked about this before, but we're continuing to see this trend persist in the motivation question that science centers ask about what are the top 2 reasons why you visited. This obviously isn't the full list. I think there's like 9 or 10 options, but people select their top 2, and these were the most interesting 3 that had some differences. Notably that more and more visitors are selecting to spend time together as a group or family and fun or entertainment for my group or my children. Those were, I think, for most museums, those were always top 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, somewhere in that top range. But it's like people are feeling even more of what they felt before, kind of, and just less motivated to go to see something specific. I know some of our museums are, moving away from the like big flashy traveling exhibit model. Maybe that's why, but there's certainly still, specific exhibits and shows that people could have gone to see, and new exhibits opening all the time. But that's just like less important for visitors at these science centers than it used to be, which also could be a function of the audience change as well, because different types of audiences sometimes have different motivations for visiting. If you're not visiting with kids, you're probably not going to necessarily be motivated to entertain your kids, of course. But this trend seems to be persisting. And then lastly, this one I thought was really interesting, is that the way that I would interpret this is that there's still some amount of our previous pre-pandemic visitors who have not really returned. And so, from pre-pandemic to more recently, so these science centers are seeing fewer visitors who have come at least once in the last 2 years, and more visitors where it's their first visit in 2 years. And that used to be really impacted by the fact that we were closed. Like, you literally couldn't visit, we're closed. But now most science centers have been open, maybe with some interruptions, but pretty continuously, for 2 years now, over 2 years now. So certainly people could have visited, and it's not necessarily an artifact of the closures and the weirdness of the question. But it seems like there's still some group of people who haven't come back, or maybe it's a new group of people who weren't necessarily visiting before. And I'm sure that many of us have seen that sort of borne out in our simple attendance trends. We only recently had a day of attendance that was, matching back to what it was pre-pandemic for that time of the year. So slow but steady. But I thought that this kind of provided that answer to the question I've been wondering of, like, who are people, are they back yet? Not yet, not completely. So, and then I think just lastly, a nice final quote here, talking about sort of reflecting on an institution's priorities before and after COVID. And for this professional, saying that, pre-COVID, it was like growth, break records, go big or go home. And more recently or post-COVID, thinking more about who is our audience, who is our community, who are we serving, and how do we best serve them? Maybe a little bit more nuanced and introspective than that kind of like grow, 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 big, 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 more and more perspective that they had before. And so I think that's it. I will stop sharing my screen now. That was where we went with it. There were certainly like a lot of other interesting things that we could have gone into, in particular in that analysis of the quarter by quarter by quarter change everywhere. And that's one where I would love to do a more full look, including art museums, because, you know, art museums could contribute plenty of data to that, and just see like, what did Net Promoter Score look like? What about overall experience rating, membership visitation, or the race and ethnicity, the white only percentage? What did that look like, sort of fluctuating quarter by quarter? So that's something we hope to look into. Maybe not like right this month as stuff gets crazy again, but very soon in the future, in addition to maybe some comparisons between art and science museums to see if any of these trends or other trends are apparent. So yeah, that's all I have. I'd be happy to take questions or think about, does any of this resonate with you at what you saw at your institution or continue to see? Or do you look at any of it and say, like, that's not really happening for me? I don't think that's not our story, you know? I'm just catching up on the chat now too. Happy to get our kids out of the house effect.
Yeah, I'll hop in with
Yeah.
that. It's funny with your visitor frequency. I think I hadn't looked at that with like a negative lens at all at first, and I'm rethinking it a little bit. Express is like, wow, so many first-time visitors, new visitors, haven't been in 5-10 years. But I think you flipped it, and I think that's also important, that fewer frequent. And I realized the percent of our visitors who are members have dropped, and that's also because members dropped, and that also makes sense because members come more frequently. We have two different sites at a very different, so our Brea Tar Pits is much more tourist, like, you know, kind of world known thing. And we did see first time visitors increase as I think tourism came back. But I hadn't really yet made that connection between membership dropping and frequent visitorship dropping, because we all had this like, woo, more first time visitors, but it's not a raw number, it's a percent. So I have to think about that. So thanks for flipping the script.
I mean, it certainly could go either way, right? But that's where my mind, maybe I'm just a negative person. No, that's where my mind went right away, was like, oh, they haven't come back. Yeah.
Makes sense.
I also like this theory that visitors may have used super high experience ratings as a means of support. I like that theory.
I'm also thinking about this, you know, why people were coming piece, where they're not coming as much for a specific show or exhibit, maybe being a little bit tied to that first time visitor thing too. Like, I wonder how those are connected and related. I know that's definitely more reflective of how our organization works. We have a lot of first time visitors, and they were not at all coming for our special exhibits. But it's interesting to see that that's a trend across other organizations too. So that was fascinating for me to see.
I have a question, if I may.
Of course.
I was going to ask, do the demographics look pretty similar of the sort of pre-COVID versus post-COVID? I'm sort of curious, does it seem like we're hearing sort of slightly different answers or somewhat different answers from the same people, or does it seem like there's a sort of shift in the demographics of who we're hearing from, so it feels like it might be a different crew of people or distributed differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I have only like a limited answer for, which is that based on my conversations with everybody, I think it has varied by institution. And maybe, as Beth's quote kind of points out, and that's just looking at race and ethnicity. There's of course other variables you could look at there, like it may have recovered to what it was pre-COVID. And Elisa never saw that much demographic change in the first place, surprisingly, like you would expect to. But I haven't done a more complete look at more of the demographics, or a demographic kind of profile of people. Although it's interesting, Beth, to hear that you had a drop in members visiting. I mean, that does suggest that it's different, some sort of different people. Tom, to your question, that it's not different reasons, it's different people. I'm sure that's happening in some cases, at least.
That happy to be back and happy to get our kids out of the house effect, that really resonates with me. It was actually easier for us to get people to take our surveys in summer 2021 than it was this summer. This summer was actually really rough for us. And I don't know if that was something that other people saw too. We think maybe because the Exploratorium reopened after being closed for about 2 years last July. And so, we were like, maybe people were just like, oh, we're so glad you're open. We're so glad you made it. We love being back here. We love being out of the house. This summer, people were like, not everybody is following the health and safety protocols that I think is the right thing. That other person isn't doing what I think is the thing. And so I'm going to just I don't want to talk to people. I have an agenda. I've got, things I'm going to do. My time is there's just a different vibe in the space for the exit surveys in particular this summer. So we're really sure what the deal with that was. But if other people saw, because there's a big shift now with things reopening more, and in the Bay Area in particular, the shift from requiring masks indoors to recommending it is a big thing for many people. So other people have been having some shifts in, openness from people for taking on-site surveys. I would love to connect with you.
I'll just contribute that anecdotally, at least one other site we've looked at the response rate data, and it's gone down by more than 10 points this summer. So similarly, right? The recruitment pattern hasn't changed. The protocols haven't differed, but something about this summer is suggesting that visitors are less likely or less willing to participate in our surveying process.
Do we report on response rates for organizations as a whole?
So the combination of the Qualtrics survey database and the decline log and the tracking log, the monthly tracking logs that you all have access to on Google, allow us to calculate response rates fairly reliably, as long as each site is good about putting those numbers in. So we do have it. Allison is nodding because we track that across sites. Of course, some sites are better than others about putting all that information in, so it kind of depends.
Yeah,
We
I was
have in the
wondering.
past, in other aggregate reports, included some sort of average response rate.
Yep.
Yeah. Not here though. Sorry, you were about to say more, Lauren.
No, I was clarifying that I meant as a whole for everybody. So that's helpful to know that it's been done, but we don't have it right exactly the second.
Yep.
At risk of talking too much, going back to the health concerns and willing to take the survey, we saw very similar trends with the Delta surge. Now we're kind of leveling off with percent concerned. So just looking at the summer at our sites, it was people concerned was 40 and 44%, but I saw a big drop July, August, September, and the percent of people who said their concerns were mostly or fully addressed. And I think it probably has to do something with the fact that there's fewer people coming with concerns. And of those people, there may just not be a way for us to address anymore because there aren't the same mandates there weren't right? We're not going to, we're not requiring masks and we can't go back. So those people they just might not be satisfied, and that might just be our new normal.
And that's like the other side of that, the not at all concern data. So I'm glad you brought that up, because then we'll get into that. But like, yeah, you know, those who are still coming with concerns are perhaps harder and harder to have them addressed.
Well, and that's echoed in what Megan was mentioning at the Exploratorium. If I come with my mask on and I'm seeing a lot of people who are unmasked because our levels of comfort differ, you know, it's a difference between my perception of the health and safety risks and your ability to address them. So there was a suggestion, and I love it, to encourage some of the art museum participants to speak up or contribute their own glance at the data. Alex, you mentioned that it would, you know, especially that quarter by quarter analysis, it would have been really interested to expand our sample from an institution perspective. If anyone has looked at their data, I'm curious if there are specific trends that you've noticed since January of this year with the art museum cohort kind of taken off. Well, even though it wasn't directly related to my question, Kate, your comment in the chat is really well noted. The competition for basically leisure activities or other people's time and money, sort of, even if we're free. But that is very interesting that it might also affect response rates.
I was actually just thinking the same thing, but I was worried it was being clouded by my most recent data collection experience, where like a lot of people said no to me all in a row, and they all were in a big hurry to get somewhere. And I was like, yeah, but that's probably just me that one time, you know. Everybody was busy, but I guess I don't know. My mind was going the same place, Kate.
Recency bias, Alex.
Yeah, and anecdotal evidence and all that. Wasn't fun.
Anecdata.
Anecdata.
Sample size of 1. Ooh, yes, we could, Beth. We could share. So as many of you know, if you've ever filled out that online data collection log, we ask for a number of different pieces. Basically, you know, how many people did you talk to? How many people took the survey, which is a pseudo response rate. The QR code muddies the water a little bit. And we also compare that against the completed number of surveys in the database. The last piece that we ask for, however, is the amount of time you spend during that data collection shift, so that you can have more information when it comes to data collection planning in the future. So that comes out to an equation of, you know, how many surveys did you get in an hour? For a long, long time, the answer to that question is roughly 4, right? For some sites, it's much higher. For some shifts, it's incredibly high, right? You could go out and get 15 surveys in an hour, but that's absolutely in the summer months. If the visitors are, you know, busy enough and you're juggling 3 iPads, you can crush it in an hour or, you know, 2 hours. But that's complicated by slower months, experiences like Alex, where you just get rejection after rejection after rejection. And so that typically averages 4 to 5 surveys per hour. It also depends on the size of the site. With higher visitor flow, it can impact your ability to see new people and all that kind of stuff. But we could go back and look at some of the ranges in surveys completed per hour more recently to try and give a sense of what, again, if we're establishing a new normal. So I'll ask an easy question, which is, I'm sure you all have burning questions. Of the pre-post, you know, if we're calling it that, around data around the pandemic, what have you not seen from COVES that you're really interested in? Admitting that the data are messy, right? There's multiple methodologies and that sample sizes across sites varied so much, but what are you really interested in that we haven't shared so far? feel free to drop it in the chat as it comes to you. I'm sure, hopefully you'll get lots of ideas. But we're always looking to keep pushing this forward. And of course, some of the analyses that we presented were constrained by the size of the poster and a coherent story for this. But while you're all thinking, I'll just point out Tom's comment in the chat, which is really interesting about indoor versus outdoor response rates or people's willingness to be surveyed, because I know a number of the faces I see and the names I can read also do indoor-outdoor sampling. I wonder if anyone else has experienced a difference between inside and outside.
So for us, our building is on a major walkway along the waterfront in San Francisco. And what we have found is that if we stand outside the building or even outside of where people kind of cross path the ticketing area, mentally, they're already checked out of the museum experience. Like they're gone. They have no interest in stopping and taking a survey once they pass that threshold. Which is a bit of a shame because we would like to do some outdoor surveying, but I think that might be a constraint due to the building being right up against the public walkway. I'd be curious to know like how much like buffer space between the building and like someone's car, or before you like kind of re-enter the world, if that makes a difference with outdoor data collection like working better.
Just to add some shading into my comment there, we have an outdoor sculpture garden is where the survey rates seem to be higher. So that's a much more kind of captive situation than catching people as they exit back, out onto a sidewalk or something like that.
I also feel like the beginning and the end of your visit I was actually at your outdoor sculpture garden and saw some COVES data collection happening a few weeks ago, which was really fun. But like, there wasn't the end of my visit. I didn't know when it was going to be exactly. It was like whenever my kid started to get fussy or whenever like my parents were like, we have to go, it wasn't quite so like I'm out the door, and I will add also to Megan that we saw that same sort of like checked out thing. We've seen that many times over the years, even just standing inside the like the entry kiosk, not kiosk, the turnstiles, that's the word, versus outside. Like just stand inside and they haven't checked out yet versus stand outside and they're like, I'm done, for other data collection, not COVES.
I'll just comment that I'm fascinated and enthralled by this conversation in terms of the comments, because so many of you are focused on the metadata aspects of our surveying, not necessarily the visitor experience data, which is great, right? Like this is a gut check for ourselves. How's the survey length? How's our response rate? How's it changing over time? All of those things impact our ability to collect and analyze the data. So it's all really important, but you're all picking up on it, which is great. So we have some digging to do. So Lauren is posting an interesting question about the QR responses. Allison, do you want to comment on the FY23 data collection logs with regard to QR tracking?
Yeah. All right, reading the question. Do you mean the decline log, like I would say no, because we might capture them, we might not. They're kind of in this weird fuzzy space. So we've all looked at this year's sampling logs. We have QR and it's kind of included, but it's kind of not. And we're just trying to figure out what that response rate is and how much does that vary. I know like month to month at our site specifically, we had 100% completion on everyone who took the QR completed the survey in July, and in August it was 40%. So it's kind of in this funny middle zone of if they get complete, that's awesome, that goes towards that annual target, but we're still working out what that means for monthly targets. But I would say no, don't include them into the decline log.
Okay, but and so they don't get kind of counted as even an approach, like that person didn't exist, basically.
I count them as an approach. Either they said yes and they take the survey, they said yes and they scanned a QR code, or they said no, and all three of those are approached people. And then any of those, like, you're not eligible because you're secretly staff, or you were just stopping in to use the restrooms, we don't count those in approach because they're not eligible in the first place.
Okay, so it's probably that timing wise, it matters when the QR code gets completed. So like if we're writing in, like I was doing it at the end of the shifts, like figuring out what their completion was, but somebody might still have it open in their phone and they might complete it later. So it's like wait until the end of the month.
Yeah, we're reporting it back in the that second tab that says targets of how many QRs actually were completed. Because yeah, I think that's still kind of a fuzzy thing where we don't totally understand that behavior.
And just to address Beth's question about how many sites are using QR codes, every site should have a QR code. Whether or not you implement it, I'm not sure if that's the question, is up to you. But again, remember that the unstaffed QR functions like a kiosk, so that's separate. Don't do that unless you absolutely have to. But it's more of a accessibility feature if visitors are, have screen reading technology or other things on their device that make it more appealing for them to work on their own device, or if they simply want to take it because they are in a rush, but they're very interested in providing feedback. That's the positive spin on the visitor who wants to placate the data collector, but is not going to do it anyway, right? Scans a QR code and runs. So that's why it's harder for you, Lauren, to count that completion rate. And it's harder to calculate the survey response length, right? The survey length from anybody who does not complete it on site.
I'm hearing silence. I was going to toss out a potential answer to your earlier question about stuff that we don't see that would be interesting to know. And I don't know that COVES would be the exact right place for it, but a thing I'm constantly kind of curious about is overall, like zoomed way out, attendance tracking comparative stuff. For better or worse, that's a metric that folks are constantly interested in. Big numbers are fun, and people want to know them. And I don't know how you build that into COVES, but that's something I'm kind of constantly wondering about: is how are our peers, especially in these times, what level of recovery are other people seeing? Because the constant question is like, is that normal? Is that what it should be? And I'm like, well.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a number of other data sources for that, mostly at the association level. So I know that the Association of Science Technology Centers did a recovery type survey where they were asking for attendance numbers and tracking that across organizations. I don't know if AAMD did it for art museums or anything like that. However, you bring up a really good point, which is a number of you have asked about target setting for surveys recently. And we've still been relying on pre-pandemic attendance patterns, knowing that post-pandemic attendance has been so wonky that we're not comfortable saying we're going to adjust your targets based on what is a really unpredictable time for attendance. But again, to Alex's point of like everybody, well, not everyone, many institutions have been open for a full 2 years, almost all for at least a year. We have new data that COVES should be asking you all, right, the attendance numbers, to inform our own survey target setting. So we could probably collect that and just give kind of percentage of previous as you said, as a big number. Certainly not anytime in the next week or two, but maybe by the end of the year if we approach that intelligently. So maybe that's also my plug to all of you. If you have new attendance numbers in daily format with groups removed, feel free to send it to us and we'll plug those in as well.
I can just answer for us. One of our sites, well, the one that we have pre-COVES data or pre-pandemic COVES data, it's approaching now again like 100% of normal or 100% of 2019 for the summer, but our mix is different again. We have fewer members and we have more in our kind of like unpaid ticket category because we expanded a program for free for LA County for 2 hours, and that's going away. And our other site seems to like have stagnated in the upper 70s, 70 to 80% of 2019. So it's variable across our sites. So I'm trying to get an understanding too of like the new normal. Yeah.
So I see the chat is still being chatted in, which is great. Just curious if there are any more questions or comments about the data that Alex shared, suggestions for future analysis.
We certainly have a long list of ideas backlogged for analysis anyway, and some more meta analysis it sounds like is good to throw on there.
Wonderful. Well, if you do have suggestions that you think of after the call, please feel free to email us, coves@mos.org. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us today. It's been a good discussion. I'm thankful for Alex for digging into the data, sharing both at the conference last week and then sharing with the community of practice today. Hopefully this gave you some ideas for your own data poking. Go onto the dashboard and see if you can replicate any of Alex's findings or see if you have something drastically different and what questions that raises for you institutionally, because we're always eager to hear how things pan out site by site. So again, hopefully this was food for thought. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next month for the Community of Practice call. And again, thank you so much for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Ryan, can you leave the Zoom open for just a minute and stop recording?